Shalom everyone, welcome back to Ancient Covenant Ministries. My name is Daniel McGurr and we're going to be continuing on in our in-depth chapter by chapter teaching on the Gospel of John. Today we're going to begin doing chapter 2 and go through two extremely important events that are happening within the text and kind of go through them and set up the foundation for two distinct things. Number one, why is it that Yeshua chose the wedding at Cana to be his first miracle in the Gospel of John? What is the context behind this? Why is he doing this? And why was it that he used the miracle of changing water into wine? The second thing that we're going to cover is going to be the connection with everything that we talk about with the wedding at Cana and its connection to immediately in verses 12 through 24, where we see that Yeshua goes into the temple and he overturns the money changers' tables and all of that stuff that happens specifically at the temple, at the place of the king's house. Okay. Now, we've got a lot of stuff that we got to talk about today in a short amount of time, so let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Now, if you're new to this study, the resources that we have been using has been a commentary by Bruce J. Molina and Richard Rohrbaugh, called the Social Science Commentary on the Gospel of John. This is a pretty good resource. We're not going to be using this one too much as of today, but we have in the introduction, and we have used it also in the video for John chapter 1, which I highly recommend that you go back and take a look at those, because there's a lot of information that we covered to set the foundation up, to do the who, the what, the where, the how, and all those type of things, the context of the first century pertaining to the Gospels, okay? And this is extremely important for us to understand what's going on. And this is what we're trying to do throughout this whole series. So I highly encourage you to go back and check out these two videos if you're new to this study with us. And we're only in chapter 2, so there's plenty of time. The other resource that we're using is The Social World of the New Testament by Jerome Neary and Eric C. Stewart. And this has become one of my favorite resources on the New Testament that I have thus far. We're going to be using that today. And another one that I've just got is called Honor and Shame in the Gospel of Matthew, also by Jerome Neary. Also really, really good resource. And even though it's on the Gospel of Matthew, there's a lot of good stuff pertaining to all of the Gospels, and we're going to use this today. So, now, let's jump right into chapter 2. And the first miracle in the context of why water into wine, and why was it that Yeshua chose this specific wedding in order for it to be the spot where his first miracle occurs. This is what we see immediately in John chapter 2. This is the opening 12 verses, okay? And we're going to focus on this for a little bit. Now, everything that we talk about today, now remember, there were 6 roles that were ascribed to Yeshua at the end of John chapter 1 by John the Immerser. Okay, and those roles were being the Word, being the Light, being the Son of Elohim or the Son of God, being the Lamb of God, being the Messiah, and being the Sovereign or the King of Israel. Okay, and everything we talk about today is predicated on 2 of these roles: the King of Israel and the Son of God. Okay, and this is the context of what is happening here. Okay, and remember what we talked about is that all of the roles that are ascribed to Yeshua have a specific status that is attached to them that deems that role. Okay, and if Yeshua does not live up to the status of every one of those roles, then he cannot claim to have any of those roles, right? This is the whole concept behind an honor and shame culture, to where you have a role. There is a honorable status that is attached to that role. If it is not maintained by the role in which you are playing, then you bring shame upon that role. That role is diminished, and then you bring shame upon your king, shame upon your family, shame upon your town, and all the way down the line. Okay, so this is extremely important to remember. So now we're dealing with 2 of these roles in John chapter 2. Okay, now, wealth, clothing, table setting, and manner of dining. Let me say those again. Wealth, clothing, table setting, and manner of dining. These are all public displays of honor in the ancient world. Okay, remember, is that you cannot have a claim to honor unless it is done within the public arena. Okay, this is very, very extremely important that we understand this in an honor and shame society. Any claims to honor has to be done within publicly, because it's up to the public that they're either going to acknowledge that you have this honor, or they're going to disqualify that honor from you, and they're going to challenge you in order to take that honor away from you. Okay, now pages 146 and 147 of the social world of the New Testament. Remember, we're trying to go through all of these verses and show you the cultural background and what is going on as far as the scene is concerned. Remember, this is just kind of like a movie, guys, is we have to know what's going on in the background. What is the scene structure that is set up? Who are the players? Who are the actors? Who are the people that are involved? Why are these specific people in this particular scene? Okay, we have to go back and study these things in order to understand the actual text of what we're reading in the gospel. Now, the whole reason why we're doing this and we're talking about wealth is because I've come to find out, and we're going to share some of this with you, is that in the ancient world, capital was not what defined wealth to the people. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, right now, in our society, it all depends on how much money we have, okay? How much gold, how much silver, how much money we have, that deems what our wealth is and how wealthy we are, what our worth is. It's all based off of capital. Okay, in the ancient world, it has nothing to do with that. Okay, it is all attached to how much land a person owned. Okay, that is what deemed you as wealthy. And the more land that you owned, the more wealthier you became, and the more honorable you became. Okay, well, by recognizing that, and then going back and realizing that there was a caste system that was set up in first century Israel, to where there was only a certain amount of people that were elite that owned all of the land, and that everybody else was considered, the lower bottom scale, and they were the peasants and the common people, the slaves, and they were all at the bottom of the caste system. Then you start to realize that there's a lot more going on with the land in Israel, and what is going on with how they could never own any land, and them being the elite, being the ones that have all the honor, they have all the wealth because they own all of the land. Okay, so let's take a look at this. On page 146 of the social world of the New Testament, it says that the wealth of the elite was based primarily on land ownership and taxation. Now keep in mind, we're talking about wealth right now, but remember taxation, because we're going to talk about that pertaining to the latter half of this chapter here in a little while. So primarily based on land ownership and taxation, which effectively drain the resources of the rural areas. This redistributive economic system, as it is called in economic anthropology, served to expropriate peasant surplus and redistribute it among those in control. So basically what they're saying is that they would take the land and they would take it from the people and decide that they're going to keep it for themselves and redistribute it to those who are wealthy or those who are part of the elite status. This sounds a lot like sometimes things that we hear in our own society today, where they are taking things and redistributing the wealth and that kind of stuff. Okay. As it is called in economic anthropology, serve to expropriate peasant surplus and redistribute it amongst those in control. As in most agrarian societies, which is what they were, everything was based off of the agricultural, what they did with the land, selling of the crops, and so on and so forth. This is an agrarian society. This is what Israel was. Between 1 and 3% of the population owned the majority of the arable land in Galilee, southern Syria, and Transjordan at the time that Mark wrote. This is talking about Mark's gospel. Now let me repeat that. Between 1 and 3% of the population owned the majority of the arable land in Galilee. That's a huge chunk of land by a small percentage of people who are amongst the elite status. Okay? There are significant studies that indicate a large-scale latifundialization there during the first century of the Common Era, as large estates came under control of the Herodians and other powerful families. Firenze describes large estates varying from roughly 50 acres to the very large one of the Kawaret Ben Hassan that covered 2,500 acres. Especially important in Lower Galilee was the land controlled by the Herodian family, which included tens of thousands of acres. By contrast, Firenze estimates that the average peasant plot at 6 acres or less. That is an extremely small chunk of land, ladies and gentlemen, for a peasant person to own. Now, when we say peasants, we're not ascribing them this name as an insult. I'm going to see if I can find it here to tell you what the definition of a peasant is. But in this book, and I think I've shared this picture before, is it has a caste system that shows the social structure of the first century. And at the very top, it has the Herodians. And then it has the high priests, which remember that the high priesthood at that time was what? It was corrupt. It was bought by the Sadducees. They were not supposed to have that power. But it was bought, so they put them up there with the elite, just under the Herodian dynasty. Then you had the aristocrats. Under them, you had the retainers, which consisted of the bailiffs, tax farmers, and bureaucrats. Underneath them, you had the urban and the rural. The urban class was the merchants, the artisans, and the day laborers. And then the rural consisted of the peasants, which upper level small freeholders, lower level small freeholders. The distinction between the upper level freeholders and the lower level is that the uppers, they usually maintained about 15 to 50 acres of land, and the lower level maintained 4 to 15 acres. Okay. Then you had the tenants, the day laborers, slaves. Then underneath them, the unclean and the degraded. And then underneath them, you had the expendables. Now, let me see if I can find really quickly the peasants so I can read to you the definition of what they have here. Okay, rural peasants. In agrarian societies such as that of the New Testament era, the cities dominated culturally, economically, and politically. Yet 90% of the population lived in villages and engaged in what social scientists call primary industries, farming and extracting raw materials. Must look briefly at several groups in these rural areas who play a role in Mark's story, which this will give us a better understanding of who the peasants are throughout the Gospel of John also. Freeholding peasants, tenant farmers, day laborers, slaves, and various landless groups that included fishermen, artisans, and other craftsmen. Now for freeholder, well, let me just give you who the peasants are. Those from the Judean countryside. Peter and Andrew, James, John, Zebedee, Simon's mother-in-law, Yeshua, Miriam, James, Judas, Simon, and Yeshua's sisters. The seed scatterer in Mark 4:26, Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James. I mean, it goes on to give you a list of those that were considered peasants. They were amongst the lower class where they only owned a small chunk of land in order to survive throughout the agrarian society, right? Now, I have a quote here that is also from this book where it says that Thomas Carney, a student of wealth in antiquity, argues that unlike the modern industry economy that we have today, basically land, not capital, was critical importance in antiquity. Obviously, great wealth resided in the hands of the aristocrats with vast land holdings, but peasants, which is what the majority of the people we read about in the first century writings were, they were peasants, with small plots of land also enjoyed some relative wealth because of their land. Thus, honor in antiquity is related to wealth that is based on land holdings. Okay, now this gives us a little bit better understanding of why we talk about the land grant so much. Okay, this is why kings of nations sought to conquer other lands. It wasn't so they could take all of the money that the kings had. It was in order to take all of their lands, to acquire their lands, acquire their resources, because, ladies and gentlemen, that is what brought them wealth. That is what brought them honor amongst those people that they conquered. Okay, this is why the nation of Israel, the nations wanted the land of Israel in order to seek the blessings of the land, the blessings of the resources that Yahweh gave Israel due to the land of Israel, in the land of Israel. This is why they sought to conquer that land, because they're trying to take the land away from that king and gain it for themselves, because that gains them that much more honor. That gains them that much more wealth. Okay, so the more land you held, the more of the elite status you became, and the more honor you had amongst the people. Okay, do you see how important is understanding that this is all connected to how much honor somebody had? It's huge. Okay, now ownership of land equates to wealth, and wealth equates to honor. So we've already determined that. So you have honor. That honor is linked to how much wealth you have. The wealth is linked to how much land you own. This is why when we see Yeshua talking to the wealthy man, and he says, look, I've kept all the commandments, and I've done all of these things. What must I do now to inherit eternal life? Well, what does Yeshua tell him? Go and sell all that you own and give it to the poor. And he doesn't do it. Why doesn't he do it? It's because he knows that that honor that he has is linked to his wealth. And that wealth in which he had is linked to the amount of lands he owned. Okay, this is how all of the ancient kingdoms lived. All of the people lived this way beyond our Western mentality. And once we grasp this, so many things begin to make sense pertaining to the land. Okay, so the more land that you owned, the more wealth you obtained, and the more land and wealth, the more achieved honor you acquired. So this was a matter in which somebody would achieve honor in the ancient world, right? So the same is true for the opposite of this. Well, what is the opposite? You have the loss of land equates to what? It equates to the loss of wealth. The loss of wealth equates to what? To the loss of honor in ancient societies, okay? So one other reason why this is so crucial to grasp is that this is attached to inheritance, okay? In antiquity, everything was about carrying on what? The name and carrying on your inheritance, okay? Now, with that being said, the land grant it becomes so much more crucial to understand that when people are trying to take away the land of the king, they're trying to diminish his honor and they're trying to diminish his wealth. Okay, Yahweh is the creator of everything, right? We've already determined that in so many other things that we've talked about in the ancient Near Eastern perspective. So if Yahweh is the creator, he is the one true God, the creator of everything, that means that he owns all of the land of the earth, right? So now he takes this little tiny chunk of land and he gives it to who? He gives it to the descendants of Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to the seed of the promise. Okay, he takes this one guy's family from out of Ur and he moves them into this land and he gives them this chunk of land. Who this guy was a peasant. Abraham and his family, I believe, were peasants. So they were part of agrarian societies, and everything they did depended upon the land. Okay, so Yahweh gives them this chunk of land, promises it to all of their descendants, to the seed of the promise, and then anybody who tries to take away that land, what are they doing? They are trying to strip Yah, who is the king of Israel, of his honor and of his wealth and of his land, which all three are connected. Okay, it's all directly linked back to the honor of the king. So there's so many other areas we could talk about this. This is why the Shemitah and the Yovel, and we're going to talk about the temple being the house of the great king, which is where what? Where all of the land would have been distributed, all the blessings come forth from the temple or the house of the king. And here we're going to talk about them desecrating that house here in a few minutes. So, where honor was displayed. This is where understanding that these three areas are all connected together are going to come forth and give us a backdrop to why Yeshua chose the wedding at Cana. Okay. The elite and kings were also concerned with making sure, were always concerned with making sure that they paraded their honor around. And the wealth in what? In many public arenas. Remember what we said at the beginning, is that a claim of honor has to be displayed in public and it has to be proclaimed in public. Otherwise, you're just making a claim that nobody else is going to ascribe to you, and nobody's going to know that you even have this honor if they don't see you displaying that honor. Okay? Wedding feast. Now check this out. This is amazing. Wedding feast and birthday celebration feasts were often used by the elite and kings as a means to claim honor through the display of their table setting and the manner in which they dined. Let me read that again. Wedding feasts and birthday celebration feasts. Now, we're not talking about whether or not birthdays are pagan or not. We're talking about, in the ancient world, kings would give themselves birthday feasts, birthday celebration feasts, and all this other kind of stuff. Okay, so those type of celebrations and wedding feasts were often used by the elite and kings as a means to claim honor through the display of their table setting and the manner in which they dined. Wedding feasts were perfect for public display of how much wealth one had, festive clothing, coverlets, music, food, and, you guessed it, wine. And to run out of food or wine at a wedding feast or one of these birthday celebrations, it would bring shame upon the host of those celebrations, you see. I hope this is making sense. And I want to be able to paint this backdrop for us before we actually go through and read the verses that we're going to do here in a few minutes. Now, page 60 of Honor and Shame in the Gospel of Matthew by Jerome Neary says this. Let's begin on page 59. Inasmuch as honor consists both of claim to the acknowledgement of worth, claims often consist of public display of something worthy in accord with local expectations. We recall from the last chapter the anecdote from Plutarch which described a banquet as a theater and show in which displays one's wealth and thus claim of honor. Furthermore, in the ancient world, certain things were thought displayable and so evocative of praise, such as wealth and clothing. Now, we're not going to talk about the clothing. We're not going to talk about the manner in which they dined specifically in this chapter, because we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that in other chapters coming up later on. Moreover, one's physical body was on display, especially certain bodily parts. Let us now survey. Okay, we're going to talk about honor and wealth. And he's talking about parts of the body were also meant to be shown as public displays of honor, such as the head, the hands, the feet, and so on. And we may have an opportunity in other chapters to discuss that as well. We got to talk about why Yeshua chose this wedding. Well, it's because, ladies and gentlemen, this is the place where they would go and claim their honor by doing all these ravishing things to show how much wealth they had. Okay? Now, this one notice of Yeshua receiving rich gifts stand in bold. No, we don't want to start there. I'm sorry. Let's skip down a little bit. Yet the narrator records Yeshua discoursing about royal wealth in his parables and maxims, indicating that he knows the local code. Yeshua knows that clothes make the man and that those in soft clothes live in royal places. Moreover, kings displayed their wealth at banquets, such as birthday celebrations. Despite Matthew's lack of detail about Herod's birthday celebration, readers know that on such occasions, large numbers of high-status courtiers were fed rich foods as they reclined on fancy coverlets and were entertained by music and dancing. Yeshua knows that weddings, in particular, become the occasion for families to parade their wealth for all to see. Festive clothing, coverlets, eating utensils, music, food, and so on. Insufficiency of wine would bring, or oil, would bring shame upon the family. Yeshua's parable of a king's wedding banquet for his son provides just such information about such feasts. The king invited only the elites of his realm. Now, if you go back and you look at the feast that he's talking about in Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13, you'll see this. Only the elites of his realm to the wedding feast. Some of his numerous slaves provided a feast of oxen and fat calves, and others went to summon the guests. It appears that he also supplied wedding garments for the guest. All of this wealth stands on display to impress the royal guest, and so to elicit acknowledgement of the monarch's excellence, worth, and honor. This is simply part of the landscape of Matthew's narrative, which now we're seeing that's also part of John's narrative. It is the knowledge of the general code that serves as a foil for Yeshua's lack of wealth. Okay, and this is what we're kind of seeing, this anti-wealth that Yeshua has as far as in the eyes of the people that are living within the first century. Okay, he may not own all of the land, but remember, he has been ascribed the role of the king of Israel, right? So if he is the king of Israel, which he will be physically, he has to be able to maintain that status and to show why he's the king of Israel by going to this wedding feast, and he's going to show the amount of wealth that he has and the amount of honor that he has, because he's going to provide what? He's going to provide wine for the people at the time in which they're going to run out of wine. Now remember, in the ancient world, when they would have weddings in Israel, is they always brought out the choice or the best wine at the very beginning. And then once people got a little bit of drinking the wine and it started going away, that's when they brought out the lower class wine, and so they weren't using up all of the host really, really good stuff. Okay, so now we're going to see what happens here. So let's read the verses and make the connections of why Yeshua chose water into wine. And now we know why he chose a wedding, because he has to go to this wedding, which he really doesn't want to at the beginning. But he goes there, and he now is going to use this as an opportunity to show the wealth and the honor that has been bestowed upon him, one, by the king, by his father, and by the role that has been ascribed to him by John the Immerser and all of those that have seen that. Okay, so John chapter 2 verse 1 says, On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Yeshua was there, and both Yeshua and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Yeshua said to him, They have no wine. And Yeshua said to her, Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. And the reason why I believe that he says that is because it wasn't time for them to see how much honor, how much wealth that he actually had, because he was coming from a greater kingdom. That is the whole purpose of this happening at this wedding, is to show the honor and the wealth that he has from the dynasty, from the kingdom, okay, from the kingdom of Yahweh, not the kingdom of men or the Herodian kingdom or any king that is on the earth, okay. His mother said to the servants, Whatever he says to you, to do it. Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Now that's also a good side note to make mention of, is that these are jugs that are used for purification, right? So here we have, he's going to take the water that is in these jugs for purification, whether it's for cleansing themselves or cleansing something else, and he's going to take that water and he's going to turn that into the best wine for this wedding. That's pretty amazing right there. And there's so many things there that we could discuss spiritually, but it's just a good side note. Yeshua said to them, Fill the water pots with water. So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter. So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom, and he said to him, Every man serves the good wine first. And when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poor wine. But you have kept the wine, the good wine, until now. Now check this out, verse 11. This beginning of his signs Yeshua did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory or his honor. Some of your Bibles say his honor, which glory is also, it's honor, shame language. Okay, even if it says glory or if it's doxa, I don't know what the actual Greek word is off the top of my head right now, but it's directly linked to his honor, and his disciples believed in him. Now remember what we just read about a little bit ago in Galilee, is that the elite owned the most of that land. The most of that land where they would have what? They would have had vineyards. They would have grown all of the best crops there, and the elite would have owned all of this land, which would have made them wealthy and had an honor claim. But now here's Yeshua shows up at this wedding, right? Immediately after chapter 1, where he's ascribed the role of King of Israel, and he's going in there to parade and to display the honor that has been bestowed on him by his Father. By being the King of Israel, the one who is going to rule and reign the kingdom for 1,000 years, and then take that kingdom and give it back to his Father. So here we see that, but he's doing it by means of miraculous. He's not going in and just bringing the best wine and doing what the earthly kings would do, or the earthly hosts would do, by giving the best wine first, and then after some of it's gone, then they bring out the junk wine. No, Yeshua is taking water that was meant for purification, for cleansing purposes, and giving them that as the wine, because it shows that he has a greater honor, and he's displaying that in a greater manner in which the people would have understood. And that's why it says that this is the beginning of his signs that Yeshua did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his honor. He's displaying his honor. So now we understand a little bit better on why it is that he chose this specific place, a wedding feast, to go and display this miracle, and why he chose water into wine is because the lack of wine, remember, lack of wine brings a shame upon the host. And Yeshua did not want shame to come upon the person who was hosting, or the bridegroom of that wedding, let alone with him being there and ascribing and having this person of honor at the very feast that would have brought some sort of shame, I would think, upon Yeshua if he did not do something. Okay, so now we have context just to those first 12 verses. Okay, you see what happens when we go back and we look at the culture from honor shame perspective, from justice and righteousness, from the messenger, from the macro temple. All of these things make sense, and it's giving us a more complete picture to the entire gospel of what John is doing. Okay, now we're going to do the next verses 13 through 25. I actually would like to read them first before we go into what's happening with these verses. Okay, now there is a lot of things that we could discuss here pertaining to the temple structure and where he was, and we're going to get into a little bit of that. But we have to keep in mind what we're doing here in this specific chapter is talking about the two main roles that are predicated in this chapter. Okay, we talked about him being the king of Israel. Now we need to talk about him being the Son of God. Okay, now let's go ahead and read the verses. John chapter 2 verse 13 says that the Passover of the Jews was near, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Now remember that Passover is what? It is one of the three feasts that we are to go up, and we're to what? We are to pay tribute to the king, right? You're supposed to take the tribute of your land that you have been blessed with and bestowed with by the Creator, by the King, and you're supposed to take your tribute and offer it up to Him for thanksgiving, for praise, and for all of these things. And this is what Passover, one of the things that is attached to Passover, and unleavened bread. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves he said, "Take these things away and stop making my Father's house a place of business." So by him staking that claim, he's telling everybody within the temple sanctuary, the temple structure, that is his Father's house. Okay, directly linked to one of the roles he was ascribed in John chapter 1 as being the Son of God. Okay, his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign do you show us your authority for doing these things?" Okay, remember, he's already made the claim basically by saying that this is his Father's house, that he is the Son of Elohim. So now they're asking him for some sort of sign that he has the authority to go in there above their authority to allow the money changers and all these things to be happening within the temple structure. What sign is he going to do that proves he has the authority to do these things? Yeshua answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Yeshua had spoken. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, observing his signs which he was doing. Okay? But Yeshua on his part was not entrusting himself to others, for he knew all men, and because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man, for he himself knew what was in man. Now, what exactly is going on here? Now, the Zondervan Bible Background Commentary. If you don't have this resource, I highly recommend you get it. And I recently just came across what we're about to discuss before hitting the record button. Blew my mind. Okay, now, let's talk a little bit about the temple structure in the first century so we have a little bit of an idea of what's going on. It says that in the temple courts, in verse 14, right? He went to the temple courts. A lot of your Bibles say that he just went into the temple. But the word there is haron, the Greek word haron. And it says that for temple courts, in distinction to the temple building proper, naos, as we see in verse 220, which is the Greek word for temple, generally denotes the area surrounding the temple in the present instance. This probably refers to the outermost court, the court of the Gentiles. Gentiles were barred from entry into the inner court of the temple. A complete Greek inscription of this effect as they discovered in 1870. And we know what that says. What is it saying? Is that the outer wall, right? You guys will have the PowerPoint. You'll be able to see the outer wall. On the outer wall is they had an inscription that said that no foreigner shall enter within the balustrade of the temple or within the precinct, and whomsoever shall be caught shall be responsible for his death, and that will follow in consequence of his trespassing. Remember, in the first century, they had a huge issue with the Gentiles. They did not believe that the Gentiles got to be part of the kingdom. Remember, this is part of one of those contextual foundations that we need to understand when reading anything in the Brit Hadashah or the first century writings. We have to understand all of these different problems, different political issues, different political sects of what was going on behind the scenes of the text. Okay? Well, they had a huge problem with the Gentiles being there. So now you have this wall that has this inscription, right, of saying that any Gentile that went beyond the Gentile court and into the inner walls of the inner sanctuary, which led directly into the temple once you got beyond that wall, is that they were to be killed. Okay, they did not want you in there. But what I'm coming to realize is that they would allow the Gentiles to go inside this wall and take their money. They would take their money and have them buy sheep, oxen, doves, or any of that kind of stuff, right? But they wouldn't allow them to go past that wall for any sort of reason, or they would kill you. So now the Zondervan commentary, it goes on to also say that the money changers likewise rendered a service. Visitors to Jerusalem needed their money changed into the local currency because the temple tax paid by every conscientious Jewish male of 20 years or over had to be paid in that currency. So what they're saying is that anybody that came to the temple sanctuary, right, they had to bring their tax. Remember we said at the beginning about the elite held most of the land, they charged the people, they took their land, and they also imposed taxation upon them to gain additional wealth on top of all the lands that they owned, right? Okay, so now they have to pay the temple tax, paid by every Jewish male 20 years old, had to be paid in that currency. Well, what is the currency? Well, you would think, well, maybe it's the shekel, right? Nope. The coinage of choice was Tyrian, owing to its high silver content. The annual half shekel equaled half a Tyrian stater, or tetra, this is a funny word, tetradrachma, so that two Jews often joined together to pay the tax in one coin. And we see that in Matthew 17 through 27. I want to check that out. Let's go there really quickly. Matthew 17:27. Let's see what this says about the coin. I think this may be talking about pay Caesar unto Caesar, but I'm not for sure. So Matthew 17, verse 27. The tribute money. When they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax, well, it says drachma right here, came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Yeshua spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers?" Oh, this is interesting. When Peter said from strangers, strangers what? From the Gentiles. Let me start over. Okay, this is directly what we're talking about. That when they entered the court of the Gentiles, is they had to pay their taxation, which is supposed to be a tax. It was supposed to be just the temple shekelim, the half shekel, right? But they corrupted the system. They corrupted of this Tyrian coinage, which had a higher silver content, to where they would pay the half shekel and this additional money, right? So Matthew 17:24, when they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax, which is what they were paying or collecting inside the temple, came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" And he said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Yeshua spoke to him first. "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from the strangers or from the Gentiles?" When Peter said from strangers, Yeshua said to him, then the sons are exempt. However, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish out that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and me. Now that's amazing. And the reason why this is amazing, and this is why, man, this is blowing my mind. See, we're learning stuff together as we go through this, and I didn't even look these verses up, guys, before I hit the record button. Okay, so they often joined together to pay the tax. The merchant's primary offense was that of disrupting Gentile worship. The temple establishment had amassed excessive wealth in Yeshua's day, which made the merchants and the money changers part of a system that exploited the poor for the alleged purpose of beautifying and administrating the affairs of the temple. So here it comes a whole completely other issue that's happening with the corruption of the elite of the day. So you have all these people that didn't even belong in the positions that they had as far as the kingship is concerned, as far as the priesthood, as far as those of the Sadducees and these other various sects within first century, where they didn't even deserve to have these roles, deserve to have this honor. But here now they're working within the temple, which is what? It is the house of the king, which is what? Which is the place in which the honor is bestowed upon the people. It's where the honor comes forth, right? This is a place that is supposed to be set apart from everything else with the amount of Kedusha that is attached to it. And here you have all these people that don't even belong there, that are doing nothing but corrupting the entire system. And now they are becoming what? They are oppressing the people. They're oppressing the poor by imposing upon them not only more tax than they should have been paying, but when you find out what this Tyrian tax is, it's going to blow your mind. Now let's go ahead. I got to exit the PowerPoint here. Give me a second, so I can read this to you from just giving you the Wikipedia definition of what a Tyrian shekel is, right? And you can look this up on your own just by going to Google and Googling Tyrian shekel, and you see what the amount of stuff comes up. And every commentary that I found so far, you guys, has said that this indeed was the coinage of the day in the first century at the time of Yeshua walking the earth all the way into the 5th century. This is what this says, into the 5th century, I think, that people were still using this Tyrian shekel. Why? Because it had a higher silver content. Okay, remember, silver was a high commodity. Okay, it was worth a lot more than just having just a plain half shekel. It had a higher silver content. So by imposing this additional stuff on the people, they were oppressing them. So Tyrian shekels, right, were coins of Tyre, which in the Roman Empire took on an unusual role as the medium of payment for the temple tax in Jerusalem, and subsequently gained notoriety as a likely mode of payment for Judas Iscariot. Further interesting, whole other subject. We'll get to that when it's time to talk about Judas. But they're saying that those 30 pieces of silver, it was the Tyrian shekel. In the latest standard, which was also the one used for the temple tax, the coins bore the likeness. Now check this out. Let me read this again. The latest standard, which was the one that's used for the Jerusalem temple tax, which we're reading about in chapter 2 of John's Gospel. The coins bore the likeness of the Phoenician god Melkart, or Baal, accepted as the Olympian Heracles by the Greeks and derided as Beelzebub by Jews in the time of the Seleucids, wearing the laurel reflecting his role in the Tyrian games and the ancient Olympics. Now if you go to the PowerPoint that I posted in with the post, I've got a picture of number one, it shows the one from the Wikipedia post where it has a picture of Melkart supposedly wearing his head wrap from the Olympic Games or whatever, or it being Baal. And then the other picture I've taken it from the Logo Zondervan Bible Background Commentary to show you the other images of the coin, I think on the back side, and some of the variances of the coin. Now let's go to Melkart real quick and see what it says about that. Melkart was the Phoenician king of the city, was the tutelary god of the Phoenician city of Tyre. Melkart was often titled Baal or Lord of Tyre. and considered to be the ancestor of the Tyrian royal family. In Greek, he was identified with Heracles and referred to as the Tyrian Heracles. I want to see what other type of roles really quickly they ascribe to him. Melkart is likely to have been the particular Baal found in the Tanakh in 1 Kings 16, whose worship was prominently introduced to Israel by King Ahab and largely eradicated by King Jehu. I'm just trying to see if maybe there's some other type of role that they attach him. But it's interesting is that this image, which is the coinage of the day, you guys, is the tax that they imposed upon the people, especially those that were Gentiles and that were strangers that were coming in trying to be part of the covenant. They imposed additional tax upon them, wouldn't let them in past the courts, and then, I mean, at the same time, they're dishonoring the king. This is the whole reason on why this is happening in this chapter, because we talk about Yeshua, displaying the honor of his father that has been ascribed upon him by showing his wealth, showing his honor at the wedding, and then we immediately move into the arena of the temple, where the temple is what? Like we just said a few minutes ago, it is known as the place where the king's honor would have been displayed for everyone to see, where all of the wealth was given out, where all of the honor would have been given out, and all of these things. So here we have all of the people of the day that, like we said, don't belong in any of those roles, any of those positions, and they're dishonoring the house of the king. And here Yeshua goes in, and this is what makes the role of him being ascribed to as the Son of God so much more important, because he's making that claim here in these verses, right? Now let's go ahead and read those verses one last time, and we're going to end with this, because we've covered two extremely important areas, okay? Because now when we encounter the wealth and the honor in the land later on down the line in the rest of this gospel, this is going to make so much more sense. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those that were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins, the ones that bear the image of another god, of Melkart, that said that he was king of the city, which this is the king's house, this is Yahweh's house. He drove them out by spilling over all of their tables, all of their coins, all of that stuff, and then drove them all out. And he said, "Take these things away and stop making my Father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" So now we see why they're challenging his authority, because they're the ones that placed the additional tax in place upon these people that's dishonoring the Father and oppressing the people. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." This is why he will be king of the Jews, right? King of the city. At some point, remember, Yeshua is going to come back. He's going to rule and reign on the throne, and he will be the king of the city. Not Melkart, nobody of the Herodian kingdom. Excuse me. None of those people. It's going to be Yeshua who is going to raise that temple, which we know that he raises his temple of his body 3 days after he's crucified. And he's resurrected, and he has done, in fact, the miracle in which he said that he was going to do, and they all saw him. I guarantee you that they all saw him. The Jews then said, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" And we know that he did. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Yeshua had spoken. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know this has been a short one, but we've given a lot of context. We've gone through the two major events that have happened in John chapter 2, and I want to be able to keep it like this so we're not covering way too much material, and we have an opportunity between chapters to grasp all the material. Trust me, I'm still trying to grasp a lot of the things that we just talked about. I mean, I even mentioned some of the stuff I didn't even see, like we read about in Matthew 17, prior to even shooting the video. So these are additional things that we have to focus on. I know it's been a short one, but we've covered a lot. But now we know the context behind why he chose the wedding to be his first place of a miracle, and why he chose water into wine was to show how much wealth that was bestowed upon him, and to maintain and start to build that image of the honor ascribed to him by John as being the king of Israel, because king displayed honor, kings displayed their wealth, and they did so in public arenas, at wedding feasts, at birthday occasions, and all these type of things. And we also know why he chose to immediately go from the wedding at Cana in the text, why John now talks about him turning over the table, because he was ascribed the role of the Son of God. Yeshua goes there and says, stop making my Father's house, affirming that role that he is the Son of God. Stop making my Father's house a place of business. Stop taking this taxation that you are opposing upon these people that Yahweh never said to give them. And then there's taking that coin and they're ascribing it upon people who want to come into the covenant, that are not part of the Jewish lineage. Okay, do you see how important all of these things are? So, like I said earlier, take some time and please go back and revisit the introduction, revisit chapter 1 if you're just now coming into this study. And we're covering different things through every single chapter in order to paint a broader picture of what John is trying to get his readers to recognize and to realize pertaining to the roles of Messiah, the honorable roles in which Yahweh is the one who ascribed those to him. And Yeshua achieved the honor of every single status attached to those roles, ladies and gentlemen. He is the Messiah. There is no other one that has ever walked the earth that maintained all of this honor attached to every role that was ascribed to him. So Yahweh bless you and keep you, and we will see you again soon for chapter 3. Shalom.